So I guess what we'll talk about today in the presentation is buffer program authorities, ordinance review requirements, common issues, and violation examples to round it out. So for delegated local governments or delegation to local governments, as well as designation to local governments of the buffer programs, the implementation of these rules would be could be delegated or designated according to our rules. So kind of like with everything else, we look to the rules to determine what we need to abide by. So for delegations, the required information is listed in the rule. Local government would request a delegation from the EMC. Environmental Management Commission. Sorry, I'll try to get all my acronyms included. Part of the request is the local governments would need to document and demonstrate that they have the means and resources, financial and staff, as well as a legal framework to implement and enforce the program. Again, the program must ultimately comply with the rule, and they must have a plan to address violations that include the remedy of the impacts and the restoration of buffers and their nutrient functions, with provisions for deterrence against future violations. So that's all considered essential to the information that's provided. So the local government would request this delegation from the EMC. This request would be made by the DWR staff with their recommendation for approval or denial or whatever, and the EMC would issue or deny the delegation. Similarly, designation can be designation goes to the local governments. This is again provided for in the rule. For Randleman, the local governments implement the buffer programs within the water supply watersheds. For Jordan, it's within the entire watershed, not restricted to water supply watersheds. So in some situations, I think Paul's already touched on some of this, the DWR still retains jurisdiction in certain areas or with certain activities. For example, state and federal projects. If the multiple jurisdictions are included, in the project, then the state would oversee that. I kind of see that as kind of like the state highway system, or the interstate highway system, where you'd have multiple states with oversight at the federal level. It's kind of similar to that. Also, with local government-owned projects, we don't want we wouldn't want entities policing themselves. So again, the state would be responsible for that. As Tom, suggested, forestry and additionally agriculture. If those projects, those would be oversight would be by the state. And in areas beyond local program jurisdiction, for example, outside the ETJ of a community within the county, the state would be overseeing that. So buffer program ordinances. The model ordinance examples we have on our website have, again, the rules have recently been updated, so they may be a little bit outdated in some aspects, but the structure and the format is still the same. So if local government is looking to update, that using that as a resource is what we recommend. The question comes to us is where the buffer ordinance, resides. The final answer, or the simple answer to that, is it's up to local governments as long as the buffer rule requirements are met. Again, it goes back to the rules. That first and foremost has to be addressed. So it could be within the Unified Development Ordinance, the Stormwater, or the Water Supply Ordinance, or as a separate buffer ordinance. And I think Sue also touched on that. So development of the ordinance and updates. So updated ordinances must be submitted to DWR for approval. Again, we'll talk, the updated buffer rules would be a part of that. As Sue had said, it's not required for the local governments to update now, but if they do, we suggest you submit your information to DWR before you go for local approval in case changes are needed. So in this case, before you go to your commissioners or council, the information would already have had some DWR review for technical aspects, and so we could present, in that situation, you could present a more complete draft to your council. In addition, DEMLR, Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources, if they may need to be notified if the ordinance for buffers is within the stormwater or water supply ordinance, because they are part of DEMLR. So DWR is required to conduct audits of the delegated and designated buffer programs. Some of the things we look for in this table, for example, the riparian buffer administrator has to be designated, and as part of that, they need to be responsible for obtaining the training that DWR puts on for on-site determinations. They'd have to coordinate the implementation and enforcement of the program, and be and also this, I guess the same requirements would be for the trained staff. They have to be trained in on-site determinations, as well as implementing the compliance and enforcement aspects. Again, we look back to the buffer rule to determine that the ordinance must meet the requirements of the rules. We'd also look in the audits, we'd look at records to verify that the proper maps are used. We're again, zone 1 and zone 2 are according to the basin that the location, if the proper rules are being followed. We'd look at buffer determination letters, as well as authorizations, exceptions, variances. We look at all the records to ensure that we have the documents and the information that we're passing on to the permittees is meeting the criteria of the rules. Complaints and inspections and how those are resolved will be looked at. We'd look at notice of violations and penalties that were issued, again, making sure that all the records are maintained. Also, important part is to see how the buffer requirements are incorporated in the development approval workflow, so that we're looking to avoid the kind of the after the fact buffer issues. We'd rather have that look properly placed in the process, so that we're avoiding problems. Also, potentially, if they happen to apply, we have interlocal agreements we would talk about, or education and outreach program efforts. And I don't know that in the past we did as many site inspections, but I think that's a greater focus as we move forward and doing audits in the future. All right, so we have the rest of the talk. We'll take a look at the following areas and highlighting some of the common issues, and we'll also look at some violation examples. So buffer determinations are, you must be certified in order to make an official legally binding determination. So that would include DWR staff, the local governments that are trained. Again, you're all trained on the surface water identification training certification class. Forest Service would be who we look to for silviculture activities. So those are the three main categories of folks that are able to do these calls. They're also able to sign off. If someone else has presented a call, they would have to determine whether that is they would approve of that call or agree with it. So as Sue, I think it's been explained a couple times, we have to use the correct reference maps, and those would be the USGS topo maps and the NRCS soil surveys. The most current, or for soil survey, would be the not the web soil survey, the printed maps. And the training method we use is now version 4.11 of the DWR method for identification of intermittent perennial streams. And that class basically takes a three-tiered approach, looks at geomorphology, hydrology, and biology to determine the persistence of waters for buffer applicability. So for example, we would classify at the end of the training, you know how to classify a stream as ephemeral, which would not be applicable to the rules, intermittent or perennial, which would apply, buffers would apply. So in making determinations for any project, we would look at all the map features on the property. Again, you have to have, it has to be on the map to apply. And then you also want to, you want to verify in the field, because if it's mapped, it's only, it's buffered if it exists. So you'd have to determine otherwise to kick it out, I guess is the way it's explained. In addition to these maps, a recent aerial map is usually provided to explain the location of the project site where we've been. And Shelton's a big fan of taking photos. So that's an example of that. In the buffer determination letters, I think Paul's already covered this, but this is key information that we want to make sure is included. And again, we'll look at this during the audit. The determination only addresses applicability to the buffer rules and does not approve any activity within buffers or waters within the state. A determination letter is not an approval letter. There's no impacts are approved with this letter. I also want to note that there may be other streams or features located on the property that don't appear on the maps that we reference. And any of the features on the site that may be considered jurisdictional, according to U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, could be subject to the Clean Water Act, Section 404 and 401. But again, we're not addressing that because this is a determination letter. It's just a heads up. We also want to say that the determination expires within 5 years and offer landowners or affected parties an opportunity to appeal the determination, but that request must be made within 60 days and be made in writing to the director of DWR, and that's our address there. I think this has been covered too. Again, we refer to the table of uses for categories and threshold requirements. Jordan has the same categories as we've had up until now, and then we have, for the rest of them, we have new categories. So I think everybody's has heard a couple of times what those are. I'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. So written application may be needed. We review and issue it. The authorization certificates are addressed in 0.0611 for the new rules, and Jordan and would be in 0267 for those authorizations. And again, as Paul had said earlier, the review process includes purpose and need of the project, avoidance and minimization as a major consideration, and included with that would be an explanation of why this plan for the activity can't be practically accomplished, reduced, relocated, or reconfigured to avoid or better minimize disturbance to the riparian buffer. Again, we'd also look at BMPs or SCMs. SCMs are stormwater control measures. And you'd look at the use of those to minimize disturbance, again, to preserve aquatic life and habitat and protect water quality. And again, mitigation may also be a component, if applicable, at that project site. So if mitigation is triggered, the first thing we'd request that you do is to be sure to refer to 0295, which is the Consolidated Buffer Mitigation Rule. It addresses mitigation ratios in regard to the zones of the buffer rules, as well as to locations. It's the hydrologic area, in this case, that's designated by the HUCs, which are hydrologic unit codes. And again, if you have any questions about mitigation, please feel free to call DWR and we'll get you some whatever help you need. Regarding dispersed or diffuse flow, again, diffuse flow was used, and I think Sue has already covered this as well. Diffuse flow was in the Jordan language used in the Jordan in the past, and it's still in the Jordan rule now. However, the new rules include a more prescriptive definition of dispersed flow. Means uniform shallow flow that's conveyed to a vegetated filter strip, another vegetated area, or stormwater control measure. And the purpose is to remove pollutants through infiltration and settling, as well as to reduce erosion prior to stormwater reaching surface waters. So it's very clear on what we expect to achieve with this. SCMs can be used to meet dispersed flow requirements. They can also be used to reduce pollutants or nutrient loading rates if required. If nutrient reduction cannot be fully met, there is an option to purchase nutrient offset credit. And again, that's described in rule. The one thing to note is that proof of purchase of those credits is required to be provided to the local government prior to approval of the development plan. So that has to be set up in advance. So I'm going to take a stab at some photos that Shelton provided for common site issues. I'll start with the first top left. This is I think it's a culvert next to a roadside, and to me, it seems like excessive clearing for a right-of-way. That's a pretty broad shoulder. I would assume that that could be narrowed down so you'd have fewer buffer impacts. The one below that, to me, looks backwards. The buffer is completely removed, yet the scrub around the house that's being constructed is protected by a silt fence. So that's completely backwards to me. So this would be a buffer violations because it's a buffer violation because they've completely denuded zone 1 and probably part of zone 2 in that picture. The two on the right are utility crossings, and they can sometimes be problematic. And again, we'd have to look at the table of uses and verify, with each rule. But the width of the corridor varies according to activity type. So you do have to consult the rules to kind of verify what's going on in these situations. And the one on the left, the aerial pipe, because we don't have vegetation on the banks, armoring is required, and that can be part of the permit process. In this situation, I assume this is where buffer and 401 regulations kind of meet, because you have riprap that needs to be maintained above the normal high water mark. And if it slumps in, it'll require maintenance, so you're not getting into other issues that I guess would be kind of tangent to the buffer requirements. And then the gas pipeline in the picture on the right appears to cross a stream with a wide corridor that's cleared and maintained. I would assume that corridor could be narrowed at the stream, or should be narrowed at the stream crossing, so that you'd minimize the buffer impacts. But outside of the stream, it's not an issue for us.
Nikki, just a time warning, just a few more minutes.
Sure. Okay. So 3 more. You can. I think these are a little bit more obvious. Zone 2 is to be maintained in vegetation, and in this case, we've got a sidewalk. The other 2 buffer violations appear there's no buffer. There's been no consideration. There's been heavy equipment going through the stream and the buffer. So I think those are pretty obvious violations. Really quickly, lots buffered within lot boundaries. When buffer requirements are included within a lot, cities and counties shall require that the riparian buffer area be shown on the recorded plat. If it's not platted, the potential for non-compliance within the buffer rules is an issue. So in this situation, we highly recommend having lots exclude buffers and streams, kind of have developments consider common areas for those instead. And the last thing, conversion to residential. Tom kind of alluded to this as well. Once you've changed the use, you get, if you're claiming an agricultural exemption, once you change the use from agricultural to anything else, that exemption ceases. So once you get to a residential plan of development, that needs to include buffers, because that exemption no longer holds. And I think that's it. Any questions?